Let's talk about the this keyword in JavaScript. So consider the following example where I have a person object, and then I have the name property, which is John, and then I've got the greet property, which is a function, and then when that function gets called, it's going to say, hi, my name is, whatever this.name evaluates to, okay? And so then if you look at line 8, I'm actually trying to use my function, so I'm saying person.greet, and when I run this code, it very simply says, hi, my name is John. So it works exactly as you would expect. Now let me make a small change. And what I'll do is I'm going to comment this line of code out, and then I'll bring these two lines in. Let me just briefly explain what they're doing. Essentially, I'm taking the person.greet function and I'm assigning it to some local variable out here called local greet. And so ultimately now this local greet variable is really just pointing to this greet method that I have on my person object. And then I'm trying to invoke the function. So you would expect it to work exactly the same way, but it doesn't because now it says, hi, my name is undefined. So let's think about what happened here. So let's kind of take a small detour and let's talk about something called context in the context of a conversation you might be having with another person. Okay, so imagine you're just sitting in the office, you're minding your own business, doing your work, and then suddenly one of your colleagues might blurt out and say like, wow, yeah, that was an unbelievable movie. And you're gonna be like, which movie? What are you talking about? So the reason why you might be confused as to what that other person might be talking about is because you're missing context. No specific movie was talked about. There's nothing that nothing that you have in your mind that you can kind of use to point to give you some idea of what the person is talking about. But on the other hand, imagine if you're actually in the middle of a conversation talking about a specific movie, and then your other person, whoever you're having this conversation with, might go ahead and say, yeah, that was an amazing movie. At this point, you'll clearly know what that person is actually talking about because what you now have, which you lacked earlier, is context. And so similarly, I think we can kind of do the same thing in JavaScript. So ultimately, whenever JavaScript comes across a function which is trying to use this keyword, the way that JavaScript evaluates what this is it looks for context. It looks for something called execution context, which clearly works differently than a typical conversation context. But for our analogy, for the understanding of how this keyword works, it'll suffice. And it should help you kind of clarify this idea. And so basically, we're coming to this greet function, and in JavaScript sees we're trying to call this.name. Well, this is a very ambiguous term. I don't know what this means. So let me go ahead and figure out what this means. That's basically the conversation that JavaScript is having in its head. And so the way that JavaScript typically does this is to go ahead and look at the call site of wherever this function is actually getting called. So let's go back to the way this was in the working state. So here's what's happening. As you can see, at the call site right now, where the greet function is actually getting called, it's getting called off of the person object. So that kind of tells JavaScript, this must be person, because when the function is actually getting called, it's getting called off of person. So JavaScript now can fill in the context and say this is referring to person. Because again, the way that JavaScript fills in the context is by looking at the call site of a function. But in the non-working state, what ended up happening is, even though technically this is exactly the same function because all I did was kind of take this method and apply it to this local variable, but it's still the same function. But all we really care about is the call site. And since here, it is no longer person.greet, therefore JavaScript can no longer say that this becomes person, because person clearly has a name property on it, which is why this works. But out here, since it's not actually person calling it anymore, it's just the global context which is calling it. Therefore, global doesn't have a name property on it, and that's why the function actually doesn't work, because it just gives us undefined. So again, to kind of sum this up really quickly before we take this a step further, if you ever come across a function in JavaScript that's trying to use this keyword, the best way to understand what this is referring to is to go look at the call side of the function. Because that's basically what JavaScript is going to do. Whenever the function gets called, that's the information that JavaScript is going to use to kind of fill in the gap and say, that's what this is referring to. Okay, but there are some caveats to this. You have something called call, apply, arrow functions. The kind of one caveat that I want to talk about in this video, I will make a separate video about arrow functions, but call, apply, and bind kind of all fit into sort of the same boat of how they deal with this. I'm going to talk about bind, but mostly call and apply work mostly the same way with a few minor differences. But if you understand bind, you'll understand call and apply as well. So let me explain how bind works. So let me get rid of this code now. Okay, and now let me do this. Let me go ahead and say that I want local greet function to be equal to person.greet, but I'm going to do something. I'm going to basically tell JavaScript that I want it to bind always to the person object. So now if I run this code, let me just bring up my terminal, run this code, and now you see it actually works. Okay, and so this is basically to kind of come back to our conversation analogy. This is effectively like somebody coming up to you and telling you, yes, Shawshank Redemption was an incredible movie. Basically, now there isn't some kind of ambiguous term. It's being, the context of what this other person is talking to you about is being explicitly stated. He's saying he's talking about Shawshank Redemption. And so that's kind of what we're doing here. Whereas normally what JavaScript is going to do whenever it sees that this keyword is going to try to use some other information to figure out what this ambiguous term is referring to. In this case, this is you, the developer, telling JavaScript specifically, don't worry yourself about figuring out what this is referring to because I'm telling you. So essentially what bind is basically doing is it says, okay, I'm going to take this greet method and I'm going to return a new method called local greet in this case because I'm catching. So basically bind will take your current function and return a new function bound to whatever you want to bind it to. And so therefore I'm catching it as local greet. But more importantly, I'm telling JavaScript, no matter where this function gets called, you might see this function getting called in some very strange scenarios. Always know that inside of it, this should always be referring to the person object because I explicitly told you that. Well, I hope that was clear. Hope you enjoyed the video. I look forward to catching you in the next one.